Good morning, dear friends. Today is the 6th of Mar Cheshvan, the 12th of October. It's a Tuesday, and we're gathered here once again to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Masechah Shabbos, chapter 8, page 80B. That's Pei Amud Beis. And with Hashem's help, we'll turn today to Pei Aleph Amud Aleph. Just going to hit mute all. Of course, please unmute. Yesterday we finished the Mishnah. It was one of the series of Mishnahs that talk about the measurements of or the sizes, volume, depending on what we're talking about, of stuff that you cannot carry out on Shabbos because of its function. That's the really short version. We finished the one Mishnah, but we're going to do some more Mishnahs. I believe the previous Mishnah spoke of items that were a little closer to being a finished product. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about materials that I think are a little bit more on the raw side. You'll tell me if you agree with my definition. So again, we're Pei Amud Beis, that's 80B. And today we're learning the Eloi Nishmas, Daniel Yerachmiel ben Gedalia, and in prayerful wishes for a speedy recovery for all those that are in need. And we'll mention again Leah Basvita, Shimon Halevi ben Leah, and also we'll mention, let's see if I can get the name. There's someone on the other Chabad community in Hallandale who needs a refuah shlema. So we'll mention Baruch Eliezer ben Rusa Esther to have a refuah shlema kreva, as well as good news for all of our wonderful members of the Talmud Chabura. Let's share the screen and start a new Mishnah, which we actually started briefly yesterday. Again, here we go. I don't know the word Adam because he can't definitions. Clay is earth. Out ruddy definition of anybody else that for now. Earth, that's going to, what one would use a kind of to track and point B, which is the item. And so I guess we can. I can't tell you what
every you see.
I already heard the question for you.
Figure it out.
You remember the question, Beryl?
All right, Beryl, please go ahead. Now I can hear you. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying a seal is used today on every single container on a ship. You get your merchandise, that seal has to be closed.
So you're saying today as well, we
Absolutely.
use seals. Yeah. And okay, true. Well, I don't know. You know those big shipping containers?
Yeah.
Is there a seal on them?
Absolutely.
It's a lot.
Okay, good. I'm not. Unfortunately, I'm not in that state. I'm not in that part of the commerce world. So okay, very interesting. Okay, so but as in those days, they had a seal. I suspect the material the seal was made out of, as well as the size of the seals, probably varied slightly. I suppose we could probably agree on that. And so the amount of earth that was used to put as a seal on these bags, that's how much earth is not allowed to be carried. And we could imagine this is the smallest prevalent use of earth. Did Rabbi Akiva, according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. The sages, the other sages say, it's a smaller size. It's the size that is used as a seal for a letter. Rashi, it's done so that no one should touch a letter. Obviously, the Chachamim are providing a smaller measure for the size of earth that's prohibited to carry. So let me ask you here, who is Machmir? This is just a basic exercise, but just to help remind us of these principles. Who is more strict, Chachamim or Rabbi Akiva? Who is more strict? The guy who says that earth is used for a seal on a letter, or the guy who says a larger seal on a shipping container?
Seal on a letter.
So the seal on the letter is smaller, and that means more machmir. Because the smaller an item is, it means you're prohibited from carrying even a smaller volume. I know it's obvious, but we need to keep on reminding ourselves, because sometimes small is better, sometimes small is worse. Here, smaller means more machmir. The Mishnah continues. I'm sorry, go ahead.
For letters, didn't they use some form of wax, actually, rather than earth?
So I believe that you're correct, that we imagine that typically wax is used. but that's possibly a more recent development. What we do know is that in ancient times, the times of Tanakh, let's say, they would use clay. And thank God they used clay, because thanks to that, we have a lot of archaeological evidence of individuals who we otherwise wouldn't know existed. So I think if we'll watch this portrayed in media, let's say, or in a movie or whatever, so I think we would typically see that with wax with a little indent. But it appears that in the time of the Mishnah, they used earth, and at least sometimes. Rebel?
I can't picture earth as being part of a seal.
Not earth, but if it's clay
mud, clay,
or mud that hardens.
Yeah, clay I could. Yeah.
Clay. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about an earth it's clay-like. And that now you understand why Rashi didn't just say, since when does Rashi need to tell us what Adama is? It's like the most obvious elementary word that a person should know, except that here we don't mean any earth necessarily. We mean earth that's used in these fashions. Which I guess leads us to ask a question, which we're not going to dwell on this very moment, which is, okay, what about earth that can't be used for a seal? Is that permitted or prohibited to carry? So we'll keep our eyes peeled for that question. But suffice it to say, here we're talking about earth that has a function. Its function is it hardens and it's used as a seal, some kind of clay. And the machlekes here between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim is which kind of seal. And perhaps, let's read the Mishnah further, and then we'll be able to spend some more time.
Maybe that's why, Rabbi, there was a mention of red, the color red in the earth, because red earth has more possibilities for hardening from iron and this and that and the other thing.
Interesting. Let's do this real fast. I know I said I wasn't going to, but let's bounce to the Rambam just for a brief moment. Here, Adama if you are going to carry Adama, earth, that's going to be used to seal a letter, etc. So those are all problematic. So here he says Adama kedei lasis choisam. So by giving that definition, we understand that not every type of earth can be used for this function. But if you're going to use earth for this function, well, then it is prohibited to carry. So that is Rashi's definition. Well, that's really the Mishnah's definition. I know. I'm sorry. I made a little mistake here. Let me show you this. Here's the Mishnah. Here's the Mishnah in its original form. And just want to make sure that the text we opened here is a Mishnah. Yeah, here's the Mishnah. Same text as over here. And it says Adama. But I want to open now the commentary on the Mishnah. And one of the very classic Mishnah commentaries is the Rambam. So the Rambam not only has a work of halacha, but prior to creating the work that we call the Mishnah Torah, or he called the Mishnah Torah, which is his work of halacha, Maimonides also created a commentary on Mishnah, which the Rambam's formula of developing the ideas that eventually become part of the Mishnah, part of the halacha. The Rambam's first work of this sort was the Pirush HaMishnayos. Anyone here, before we start reading his text, know the difference between the Pirush HaMishnayos, or a very major difference between the Pirush HaMishnayos and the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam? What's the famous difference between these two works? So I'll tell you. Maimonides wrote the Pirush HaMishnayos in Judeo-Arabic, whereas the Mishnah Torah was written in Hebrew. And so when we study the Pirush HaMishnayos, we are essentially studying a translation of his work, which was originally written in Arabic. But now let's take a fast look. Rambam on the Mishnah. Adama kechaysim hamartzufim divrei Rabbi Akiva. Adama, what is Adama? Tit, Edom, or Adom, red earth. Yasu mimenu chotamot ala sakin. And they would use them to make seals on bags. Shemasimim behem asochare mimonam hanekraim arsufim. The people would stick their stuff in there. And similarly, this red earth can be used as a seal for a letter. So here is where the Rambam explicitly uses the word Adama. It wasn't in his halachic work. It's in his Pirush on Mishnayos. And now you know what we're going to do? If we can, let's keep this Mishnah open on a tab next door in case we have any other questions we'd like to reference. But now we're going to go back to Rashi and continue our Mishnah. Zevel v'choil hadak. What about manure and fine sand? How much manure? Now, I don't know if any of us ever thought of seeing some manure on the floor and picking it up and putting it into our pocket. I hope not. However, if you're in agriculture, and Alan, maybe you'll confirm for us, at least once upon a time, the primary stuff that was used for fertilizing was manure. So, zevel v'chol hadak, kedei lezabel kelach shel kruv, the amount of manure that would be used to fertilize a stalk of a cabbage. Now, I don't know if you recall, but we actually referenced this Mishnah earlier on, we were talking about the difference between how we value a seed versus how we value a sapling or something that's actually sprouted. That's where we reference this. But suffice it to say, the Mishnah says that how much manure is prohibited to carry, the amount of manure that you'll put on a single stalk of cabbage. Divid Rabbi Akiva, this is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. The Chachamim say no. Kidei lezabel kiresha. It's the amount of earth that one would use to fertilize a leek.
Is generally a leek.
A leek. So what's bigger, a cabbage or a leek? A leek is going to be smaller. A cabbage is going to be bigger. So I imagine that you need less manure to go around a single leek stalk than a cabbage plant, which is wider. I may be wrong, but that's my impression. Let's see if Rashi has anything to say. Yes, Rashi. Kresha. We're talking about a smaller plant and a smaller amount of manure. So once again, the Chachamim have a more strict viewpoint than Rabbi Akiva. Chol Hagas. What about Reb Errol?
Today you would have a more practical situation. Pick up after your dog.
Very interesting. I don't want to go there now. No, but that's a very interesting question because you're here. You have to pick up after your dog.
Right.
Is it muksa? Is it? Okay, I don't want to go there now, but we do actually do need to spend. Reb Errol, we actually do need to spend some brain cells figuring out exactly the halachas of picking up after your dog. It's a very good question, but I want to put it on the side. We'll add it to Dr. Hammer's list, but it's actually such a good question. Bli Neder will have to address it when we talk more about muksa.
Like all of a sudden, it's not so ridiculous that somebody's picking up manure. That was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah. Listen, I was walking at night. I don't usually have a chance to exercise during the day, but occasionally I try to go walking outside at night. And I see a lady. She's like all with a flashlight looking, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe she lost her wedding band or a diamond ring or something. I'm like, excuse me, can I help you? Is everything okay? And she tells me, oh no, I'm looking for my dog's manure. Or she left. I said, okay, I'll leave you to that. But
Picking manure is not so strange at all. Maybe it's today sounds strange in the United States, but in poor countries, I think it's up to now. This is a useful habit. In my childhood, I used to live in the place where there were no trees, and cow and horse manure was used for fuel. And as a child, I personally picked it up on the street for my mother.
Thank you for sharing that. It reminds us, just in case we're feeling like we want to kvetch about life, we should recall.
At that time, I didn't know about Shabbos.
No, but the point is, people kvetch all the time. Oh, you know how difficult it is. I mean, look, I don't mean to diminish anyone's life's difficulty, but next time I speak to someone, they complain about the fact that their Tesla is temporarily in the shop and it's so difficult, they have to use their second car. I'll tell them, well, someone told me today about they recall in their childhood having to collect waste in order to use as fuel to keep the house warm in the winter. So if the complaint is that the Tesla is in the shop or whatever, so we have to put that in context. So thank you very much for sharing that, as well as to remind us that this is not as strange as I might have assumed. But so now, Professor, now we have to ask, hold on, Professor, let me ask you a shaila. What's more volume? The helpful amount of manure or waste that's going to be used as fuel, or the amount to fertilize a single leek? And so I imagine, although I may be incorrect, that to fertilize the leek is a smaller measure then so that's probably why the Mishnah doesn't mention that, because now that you say it, indeed, it's a good source of fuel. Shkoyach. All right, let's continue the Mishnah.
Only
Has to
for
be
its
dry.
methane.
I'm sorry.
Only if the
It has to
motor
be
runs
dry.
on methane.
It's not, it's as a manure, as a fertilizer, it probably doesn't have to be dry, but to be used as fuel, it has to be dry.
Mhm.
So it has to stay on the land for a long time.
Oh, so you dafka be collecting. By the way, I hate to break it to my dear friends here, but tomorrow or in the day after, our Gemara is going to have a temporarily a small discussion about muksa and carrying on Shabbos as it pertains to stones that might be used in the process of removing waste. And so there will be an opportunity to revisit this discussion just briefly in a day or two. So I'm sorry to have to alert you to this, but Be'ezer Hashem will have another small unit on as it pertains to muksa and carrying and that. So we'll revisit it briefly. But now back to the Mishnah, Chol Hagas. So we talked about fine sand, but what about more coarse sand? Or so what is that going to be used for? Or what's the smallest use, and therefore what's the measure that's prohibited to carry? Kedelitain al moloi kafasid. It's the amount of sand that could be placed on top of a spoonful of seed of lime. We talked about lime yesterday. And Rashi right away alerts us, the Gemara Mefarish Kafshal Sayadin. The Gemara is going to explain what exactly is the story with putting sand and why you have a spoon of lime. Kone, what about a reed? How big or how much of a reed is not allowed to be carried on Shabbos? So the Mishnah says, Kidei lasois kulmus. It's the amount of reed that is turned into a writing implement. And as we know, although in the Jewish tradition we use a feather for writing, I believe in ancient times it was equally reasonable, perhaps more reasonable, that they would use definitely certain cultures would use a reed in order to use a reed as a writing implement to make it into a quill. Okay, I guess kolmos generally means is a writing implement. But okay, but what if it was too thick, or is broken, and it is not in the right style to be used as a quill, as a writing implement? So then, it's the amount of wood that is used to cook the smallest of eggs. What does it mean? How would you use a piece of wood to cook an egg? So I don't want to sound detached from reality like I did before about the fertilizer, but I imagine we're talking here about using it as fuel. That's my understanding. The amount of fuel to fire up a fire to cook the smallest size of an egg. That it's scrambled and in a frying pan. Just make sure you got that right. Okay, beaten and placed in it. All right, I'm going to stick with my translation. But anyways, trufa means beaten, but I believe it means broken up and in a pan. So here we see that the default, well, I don't know if it's the default use or if it's maybe, but we have a use of a scrambled egg. So there we have it. This is the Mishnah.
It's not a non-stick pan we're talking about. We're talking about those old.
Oh, now we have to know if it's a non-stick pan or if it's, how do you call it? What's the, or a cast iron, cast iron pan. So we have a lot of questions that remain unresolved, but suffice it to say, this is the Mishnah, a series of items that we look at as unfinished, and yet there are specific uses for them. I have the Rambam open anyway, so let's take a peek at the Rambam. If he has anything they'll be curious to us. So I guess here's what I think. I may be totally off. But perhaps a thin reed has a tube-like structure that, if it's cut just right, can be similar to a quill in its ability to contain some ink and to write upon. Does that sound correct? I'm just
Also,
gonna, please
the
indulge me
thickness-
for a moment.
also the thickness of the reed, you can make a letter, a legible letter with a thin reed. If the reed is too thick, the type of letter you're going to make is not going to be conducive to reading.
Here, so let's go to the holy Rabbi Google and his. So Rabbi Google is one of the great commentaries in the Talmud, and so Rabbi Google explains to us that reed pens were used for writing on papyrus, and were the most common writing implement in antiquities. In Mesopotamia, Sumer reed pens were used by pressing the tips. Okay, so the reality, the interesting thing is, as we know, there are different forms of writing. There were different alphabet in the ancient world. And so what I imagined, I'm going to confess, what I imagined was, as is initially explained, it's the use of a reed pen to write on papyrus. But what I did not realize, or what I didn't consider, is that we know that there were earlier writings from Sumer and Mesopotamia, including which are dated back to the period, or here, which they also would use reed pens to write in the clay. And as you know, there were different markings which you probably recognize. And so that was also used by reeds. So reeds were used for writing both to carry ink, but even before the prevalence of ink and before the writing on papyrus, they were also used to write on those clay tablets. And just by the way, if you're interested in Jewish, the crossover or between Jewish archaeology and Iraqi archaeology, we know that there are tablets from the era following the fall of the first temple, where there were Jewish tradesmen, and we have cuneiform tablets where they write about their business. And the reason why archaeologists assume they're Jewish, although they weren't talking about matters of religion, they're talking about business, is because the names had distinctly Jewish Hebrew names, or the use of Hashem's name in their names. And so that's something very interesting. But back to our story over here, a reed can be used as a writing implement. And let's just do one more thing. Please indulge me. Reeds. Let's just do this. Hold on. I'm gonna give us some nice pictures here. All right. Well, in case in case our imagination didn't help us, here you have a pointy stick making markings in ink, and here you have some of the common cuneiform, some of the common signs, and again the theory of how these signs developed, and if they reflected, if they were initially developed because of the need to mark agricultural excesses that were stored. That's for another time. But suffice it to say, here is how they would use it as a pen, or here we have it drawn as more of like a quill, as we would have imagined. But anyways, that's the story. And
Well,
here is a
actually-
tablet. I'm
Actually,
sorry.
it took us 3,000 years to get from hieroglyphics to emojis.
Basically, you're saying we've gone back to where we came from.
Exactly.
I give out.
And look
Well,
at the
anyways.
picture of the iPad, the guy with the iPad on his holding it in his left hand, data on clay. There you go.
Yeah. So today we have a stylus as well.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to the Gemara. Anyways, but there's some pictures. So the Gemara starts. The Gemara skips any commentary on Adama, and this discussion is fairly simple. So we're going to start off talking about the sprinkling of earth, of sand on top of a spoon of plaster. So the Mishnah says, "Amaloi kafsid." The coarse sand is used to sprinkle on top of a spoon of plaster. Let's hear Steinsaltz how he translates it. It's the equivalent to that which is used to place on a full spoon of plaster. Okay, that's what we said. Tana, Tosefta explains, what is this use? Kidelitein alpi kaf shel sayadim. It was placed, this sand was placed on the opening of the plasterer's trowel. Not in eating. So not that we're using a spoon for eating, because it's not for eating, but it's for using it as in construction. So the Gemara now asks, is sand good for lime, which was used in construction? Here we're translating it as plaster. So is sand actually good for plaster? Does it help construction? Rav Chisda, or rather, I'm sorry, Mantana, who is of the opinion that sand is beneficial to enhance the quality of plaster? Who's of this opinion? Rav Chisda, Rabbi Yehuda. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. How do we know it's Rabbi Yehuda? There's a brayso, the Tanya, Lo Yasud Adam as Beisai Besid. A person is not allowed to use plaster on his home. I'll explain this in a moment. Elim Kain Eder by Teven Echol, unless he mixed into the plaster straw or sand. What's Rabbi Yehuda talking about? Why would a person not be allowed to use plaster on your home? And if you can't use construction materials, how are you going to build your structure? And so here is the story. A home that's unfinished, that's unplastered, could still be a home. It's just the walls maybe aren't smooth, they aren't nice, they aren't white. I don't think in those days they did a lot of painting, and so the plaster was the finish of the walls. And so Rabbi Yehuda teaches that Rashi, la'achar churban, after the fall of Jerusalem, and there were a number of enactments to preserve a sense of national mourning, that they no longer had the temple and our homeland. And so there are a number of generalized practices to preserve mourning, including restrictions on certain foods, restrictions on certain musical instruments, and also a restriction on beautifying one's home. And so Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you're not allowed to beautify your home with plaster unless you mixed into it teven and chol, straw or sand. What do they do? Well, straw and sand diminish the clean look, and it diminishes the brightness of the plaster. So ironically, what's Rabbi Yehuda saying? What's the Mishnah saying? Sand and straw downgrade the quality of the appearance of this plaster to the extent that you'd be allowed to use it. So although really you're downgrading it, but it's a necessary downgrade. That is what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. So it's a little bit, I think, unexpected. We wouldn't have necessarily expected this, but that's what the Mishnah is saying. So again, who says that a person wants to pour sand into their plaster? Why would you want to do that? Would you pour dirt into your paint? And so the answer is yes, because you can't have you don't want to have pristine plaster, but you could use it if it was somewhat ruined. Rabbi Yehuda says, Tevin mutter, you're allowed to use straw, chol aser, but you're not allowed to use sand. Because when you put sand, it actually strengthens and improves the earth, the plaster. So let me so again, you want to downgrade your plaster. I must have misspoken. Rabbi Yehuda says that sand doesn't downgrade your plaster, it makes your plaster better. Being that Rabbi Yehuda says the sand makes your plaster better, we can assume that Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that sand improves the plaster. So I misspoke. I was saying that Rabbi Yehuda says that you could use sand because it downgrades your plaster. That's true, but that's not what the conversation was being. Because Rabbi Yehuda says sand makes your plaster stronger. Therefore, if you're in mourning, you shouldn't use it on your home. But therefore, we see that sand is good for plaster. Rashi, Trachsid, Sid Chazak Umiskashi Yoser Mishim La'irba. Because when you put sand into your plaster, it somehow becomes even stronger. So again, I'm making a slight correction. There is a notion of not putting plaster on your home, and if you taint it, you could use it. But Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says you can't use sand because it doesn't taint it, it improves it. And therefore, by the time of the Mishnah, where people were living in Bavel and perhaps not even observing all of these extreme rules of mourning, well, because you want to put sand in, therefore you can't carry it because it's useful on Shabbos. I'm sorry if I made anyone confused over here. Rava Amar Afilu Temer Rabbanan Kilkula Yizeu Tikone. Rava says no. Even the Rabbanan might agree that you're allowed to use sand in. I'm sorry. Rava would teach that even the Chachamim might agree that sand is good for plaster. Therefore, sand is prohibited from carrying, because the Chachamim who say you're allowed to put sand in your plaster, they say, listen, you may be strengthening the material, but you're downgrading its aesthetic beauty. And so the Chachamim say you could kill two birds with one stone. You could put sand in your plaster, and it'll still be a spirit of mourning. Although you'll have a quality, the job will be a good quality, but it's going to also be downgraded in its aesthetics. And so sometimes in construction, we need to make a sacrifice. You sometimes will sacrifice beauty for something to be structurally sound. And so, for example, sometimes you're building a building and they want to put in extra, what's called the columns. Unfortunately, columns usually could be detrimental to the open feeling unless you hide them in your, but especially if you look at many of the condos we have, so the old condos just had columns all over. The newer construction, they know how to use them and hide them all. So anyways, long story short, our Mishnah says placing sand in plaster. Our Gemara says, is placing sand in plaster a thing? And so the Gemara says, yeah, we think Rabbi Yehuda says it's a thing. How do we know? Because Rabbi Yehuda says putting sand in your plaster is not allowed because it strengthens the plaster. But the Gemara says, no, maybe everybody agrees that putting sand in plaster is a thing. The question, the machloikas, when it came to the morning of Jerusalem is, do we allow you to use a solid construction material if its appearance is downgraded, or do we say no? Because you desire to put it in, it becomes part of the look, and because it's part of the look, that's not consistent with the mournful spirit over Yerushalayim. So that is this little segment in Gemara. And any comments or questions? All right. Next segment of the Gemara today. Now we're going to talk about a reed that's used for writing. Kana kedelasa is kulmus. So the Mishnah says, how big of a reed can't you carry? It's the size that is a pen. I shouldn't have closed my last window because, hold on, we'll open up writing. No. Reed. Okay, so here we have some pictures of what we would imagine a reed stylus might look like. Now let's see the Mishnah, the Gemara. Tana, how big? How long? So we said it has to be functional as a writing implement. But what size reed qualifies to be turned into a reed stylus or a reed pen? So there's a Tosefta that says, Kolmos hamagia lekishriyetz ba'esav. The pen, the writing implement, or the size of the reed that's able to go between your fingers and reach your joints. The problem is, what's the problem? There are multiple joints on your hand. And so which joint are we referring to? Boy, Ravashi asked a question. Kesher ha'elyon, or kesher ha'tachton. Are we talking about the which joint? And depending on which joint, you might give a few extra centimeters to your stylus. And so the Gemara ends off with Teiku. This unfortunately must remain an unresolved question of the exact dimensions of the writer's stylus. Any questions or comments? And I'm also trying to assess if my sound.
Yeah, I
Doctor?
mean, they discuss every other size. So Dafka here, they get stuck on whether it's the first joint or the last joint. They've been going through so many different combinations of different foods and as far as sizes, and here they get stuck.
Because they have a Tosefta that gives a measure, but we don't have the exact tradition. So let's see, what does the Rambam write? I'm looking at the wrong Rambam, hold on. Well, let's see if he gives any more details here. Hold on. Bear with me one more moment. Let's look in the Mishnah Torah. Well, we have it in English. It's fine. The measure that determines liability for carrying out a reed is the equivalent to making a quill. If the reed was thick. Okay, so the Rambam doesn't even specify. Interesting. I guess because there's a question. So doctor, but help me out over here. Let's think this through a little bit. So we're saying that a piece of reed can be used for a kulmus, but we're not sure exactly the dimensions of the standard quill. What do you make of this?
The dimension pertains only to the length.
No, we've already established the width is obvious.
The thickness we decided on. So it's
Right.
only a question of the length now. So now to me there's a minimum length that you would be able to hold the reed. I mean, you have to be able to, like, a pen or a pencil. It gets to
Well,
a point where
let's think about pen, pencil versus the little pencils and a piece of chalk, right? So
Right.
different.
So the question is that it comes to a point where it's really uncomfortable to use a pen or a chalk or a pen or a pencil. So I
Well,
would
let me ask
say
you, those little pencils, what are those meant for?
for little kids,
I think they're meant for like carpenters. No, they're meant like for small markings as opposed to extensive.
well,
Writing.
you can use a large pencil also for markings.
But why wouldn't they do the obvious? If you say the reed has to be thin enough to be able to write, why can't we say it's long enough for someone to hold it in some way?
That's where I was going with it.
You know, that's exactly your question. In other words, so I guess the Mishnah is asking, what's the standard or what's the smallest that's considered standard for manufacturing? I'm sorry, I'm just Googling the small pencil. I'm trying to get to the bottom of who they're manufactured for. Apparently they're called golf pencils. Does that make sense?
Dixon.
So this-
Dixon.
Yeah, it makes
This-
sense because you use them in mini
To write
golf
down.
or
Bingo cards. Bingo cards.
Right.
Hold on. I'm sorry, you have to indulge me today. Who uses?
What do you mean today?
Well, today
I'll tell you,
I'm
if you
today
take
I'm-
a
I'm-
look at if you take a look at your finger, the fingers have the individual fingers have different lengths. But if you put I'll go back to the original word, the phalange, between the tip to the first line, and try to compare finger to finger, they're about the same length. Each finger, the joints are about the same length. If you just take a look at your fingers and try to reduce them to the same height. So I would say it would be kesher tachton, not kesher elyon.
You mean the smallest size?
No, the
Oh, you're right. You're right. You see, I'm thinking. You see what happens when you don't visualize?
The smallest size, you wouldn't feel comfortable holding it and writing with it. It would
So
be
hold on,
very
doctor, I
awkward.
want to just explain what you just said because I didn't consider this. The finger has multiple joints.
Correct.
The kesher tachton is the lower joint in your
Correct.
hand.
So it gives you a longer almost.
So if you're holding the pen in the point of your finger, by reaching the kesher tachton, it essentially means the pen is longer. Maybe this is obvious to you, but you have to visualize it. But I just want to, before we stop, because I want to read for you the essence of what the Sfas Emes says. The Sfas Emes says, here, remember something. Here we're talking about the raw material that may be qualified to be turned into a stylus. But if you're actually carrying a stylus, we don't care about the length. The fact that it was manufactured and sold as a stylus or it's used as a stylus, that is indication that it's a satisfactory size. So our question really here is, what is the preferred size for a reed that's going to end up going into the production of a stylus? And for that, there's a question which the Gemara does not have a tradition. And so it leaves that at a take. So that's that. So you're asking, why does the Gemara leave us with a teiku? Because the Gemara didn't have a definitive answer. And it's not the only time we've used teiku, but the Gemara usually tries to present us with an opinion. So there we have it. Let's just see if any of the halachists, I don't, yeah, no, it's just the Rambam. Okay, let's do one more segment. Let's talk about eggs. Scrambled. So is the Mishnah saying that the average standard way of eating an egg is a scrambled egg? Is the Mishnah taking a position on how you should like your egg? I'm going to say not. But before, the Mishnah is taking a position on what's the fastest egg to cook. An egg will cook faster if you've mixed up the egg as opposed to if you've left it whole. The whole yolk probably takes longer to cook than if you broke it up, which I guess is what the Mishnah said. But before we go into the Gemara, I just want to share with you a thing that happened. Yesterday, I was walking down the street and I passed by, maybe you're familiar with, there's unfortunately a Jewish lady who's homeless. She struggles with mental health issues and we tried to help her over the years and we're still trying to help her. But I walk over and I always try to say hello to her. First of all, because it's a nice thing to do, but also if you're nice to her, she'll be nice back. And if you're rude, she'll scream at you. So I'd usually rather have a positive encounter with her. And so I tell her good morning. And she said, "Hi, Rabbi, today's my birthday." I said, "Wow, happy birthday. What can I get you as a birthday present?" And this is like an interesting exercise. If someone has nothing and you ask them an open-ended question, what would you like? What would be a present? So like, what would you answer if someone that really intended to give you something? So I asked her, what would you like? What can I get you? So, Rabbi, you know what I'd really like? I'll just stay at home. I don't know. She tells me I'd really like breakfast. Could you get me a breakfast? So I said, sure. What do you want for breakfast? So she said, I'd really love an egg. But you know what? I don't just want any egg. I want it to be an over easy, which I have to confess, I'm not a big maven in different egg styles. So I ended up schlepping around, went to a place, I got her a breakfast. And then, of course, unfortunately, by the time it was ready, she disappeared. But whatever, I got her something else. Today, if I see her, we're going to give her a little birthday cake. She should have something nice in her life. But I guess the point is, imagine like if someone asks you and they intend, within reason, what could I get you? And for her, all that she wanted was a fresh egg made to her liking. And that was a very, I don't know, it makes you think. So anyways, I'm sorry to get to, so anyways, let's go back to the Gemara, talking about how to make an egg. Tirufa b'shemen u'nesuna b'ilfas. So the way you make an egg, says the Brisa, is you got to beat it in oil. There's got to be oil. You put it in a pan. Amali marbrei de Ravina lebrei mishmielach beitza kala mahi. Do you have any idea? What is the easiest egg to cook? Amarlei be'asa dit silsila. We're talking about the egg of a turtle dove, says Rabbi Steinsaltz. Rashi just says oif katan. We're talking about a very small kind of bird's egg. My time, the Gemara says, what about this egg is so easy to cook? And the Gemara answers, Mishum de Zutra. Is it because it is small? Well, then Ema Ditsi Parta. So then talk about the egg of a sparrow. Or today we'd say maybe a quail egg versus, right? They sell quail eggs. I guess maybe a sparrow is even smaller. I don't know. Ishtik, he was silent. You're right. If we're talking about a turtle dove, then why don't we go smaller? Amar lei midi shmilach bahas. He said, then have you heard something? I'm sorry, Amar lei. So he asks back, Tati, Abba, do you have something? Do you know something? Midi shmilach baha. Amar Rav Sheshes. He told him, Rav Sheshes taught, we're actually talking about beitzas tarnagolas, the egg of a chicken. My karla beitza kala. So what about a chicken egg? Is a light egg, a soft egg, an easy egg? Gemara says, Shiar chachamim. There's no egg that's easier to cook than a chicken's egg. Rashi, no. So if you ever said, what's the easy thing to cook? Are you a chef? I'm not a chef, but I could make you an egg. So maybe the Chacham used to say, what the easiest egg to cook, the least complicated, fastest cooking, it's a chicken's egg. I'm not sure if this means in the speed of cooking, which I think is really what we're talking about, or just the easiest and most likely thing to cook. But that's what the Gemara says. Yeah, so they say that a chicken's egg cooks faster than other kinds of eggs. So we don't mean the smallest or lightest egg in weight, right? Kala could mean two things. Kala could mean light, and it could also mean easy. So initially, our understanding was that we're talking about a light egg. And so we said, what's a light egg? A turtle dove? Well, then talk about a sparrow. And the Gemara says, no, we're talking about the egg that cooks the fastest. Now, this is how some of the commentaries explain. However, I'll tell you my problem. I always understood them to be synonymous. The egg that has less volume probably cooks faster, right? That's what I imagine. Less stuff to cook, it'll cook faster. I guess the Gemara answer is no, it's not always about the volume, but it has to do with the composition, the makeup, and certain eggs, I guess, cook fast. At least that's what the Gemara is saying. So the Gemara asks, Umayshna kol shur yeshabes kigeres v'hacha kebeitza. hold on. Oh, when we talk about fuel, we're all of a sudden talking about an egg size instead of a groigeres, which is the common measure on Shabbos. We're talking about the amount of fuel that's going to cook the volume that's the size of a fig of an egg. And so actually, based on this explanation, it all makes sense. We're talking about the same amount of egg going into the pan. The question is, which type of egg cooks faster? And for that, the Gemara has to discuss, and the Gemara answers a beit sakala, which apparently means a chicken's egg. Now, I got to tell you, and by the way, this is the end of the Mishnah. I got to tell you, I'm something about this Gemara is bothering me. Something about this discussion, because what does it mean, Ma'ashna Kol Shir Shabbos? Here we're talking not about the measure as much as the type of egg. But I guess the Gemara's answer is that you need both criteria. You need the easiest type of egg with a specific measure, and that's how much kindling, that's how much fuel is prohibited to carry for smashed up reeds that aren't useful in other uses. All right, I'm sorry, I was doing a little bit of stream of consciousness over here, but that is this Gemara. Any comments or thoughts before we close out our study session?
I was
Alan?
just thinking of a good way to serve this lady her egg quickly before she disappears. With the heat in Florida, you can just crack the egg and put it on the sidewalk. It'll cook in 2 minutes.
We've discussed that in the laws of Shabbos, right? We talked about cooking and fire and secondary source of fire, Aish and told us Aish. I'm sorry, Chama and told us Chama, right?
So is it possible that the term Beitza Kala means soft-boiled egg as compared to,
It's not in this context, but that's certainly a contender. Maybe the Gemara is taking a position on how to cook your egg. If it should be a soft boil versus a. Yeah. Any other egg?
But
Any other idea?
The time to cook an egg depends on how hot the fire is. There's all kinds of things.
Yeah.
You have a small flame, it'll take you an hour.
But Beryl, let me ask you a question. What determines the heat of the size of the fire, if not the fuel?
Yeah, for sure.
But it is yet an interesting Gemara. Anyways, there we have it. Let's start the next Mishnah just so we don't leave off. We finished one Mishnah today. Let's just start the next Mishnah. And also we're going to turn the page. 81A. Pei Aleph Amud Aleph. Bone. Today, I don't think many things are made out of bones. But once upon a time, you had plenty of stuff. Alan, now would be a good time for you to crack out your walrus. No, not walrus. Narwhal.
Tusk.
All right, but etzem, bone. Kedelasos tarvad. It's the amount of bone that one would use to make into a spoon. Rabbi Yehuda Omer kedelasos menochaf. Rabbi Yehuda says no, not a spoon, but to make a key. The Gemara is going to discuss what does this key mean. Is it a full key? Is it a part of a key? So the Gemara is going to discuss that. But I guess bone once upon a time was used for utensils. It was used for other items. Zechuchis, glass. What is glass good for? Kedeligror baroi shakarkar. To use to scrape the top of a bobbin. A bobbin is a sharpened stick, says Rabbi Steinsaltz, that's used by weavers. Weavers have to use fiber and threads and yarn, and sometimes you need to untangle it. And so apparently they would have a tool called a bobbin. I've never seen her use the bobbin personally. And a bobbin needs to be sharp. So how do you sharpen a bobbin? You get a little piece of glass. I'm just telling you what Rabbi Steinsaltz is saying based on the Mishnah. Rashi. Rashi says the same idea. Well, where do you think Rabbi Steinsaltz got it from? You're talking about a stick with a pointy end that's used in the weaving process. Tzurorai Evan What about a stone, a pebble? What's that good for? Kidei lizroik ba'oif, to throw at a bird. Why would the Mishnah approve of throwing stones at birds? Well, that's something the Gemara is going to have to discuss. You need a stone that you could throw at an animal. Just spoiler alert: the Mishnah is not embracing or endorsing Sar Bali Chaim, but there are circumstances that you might need to chase away an animal, and so that's what we're talking about here. I'm going to go to Rabbi Google one more time to see what a bobbin is. It doesn't look like the bobbins, the contemporary bobbins, are exactly what the bobbin was of the Mishnah.
I'll read to you the definition. It says a cylinder or cone holding thread, yarn, or wire used especially in weaving, machine sewing, and lace making.
So there's a machloikes between your definition and Rashi. A bobbin is a spindle cylinder with phalanges. So here's what we know. What's a bobbin pin? Anyways, okay. Well, the point is, it's a utensil that's used for weaving. My dear friends, please join us tomorrow. Be'ezer Hashem, we'll explore the Gemara's comments on this Gemara. We're going to talk about bone, glass, stones, and treatment of animals, as well as other uses for stones, some that may be surprising. So thank you all for joining us today. Shkayach to all the wise men, honored men of this Talmud Chabura. I look forward to Hashem's help to seeing everybody tomorrow. Big Yasher Kayach, and thank you. And we should only have good news, happy news, and healthy news for all of Am Yisrael.
Thank you.
Please join us
Amen.
in 1 minute,
Amen.
very same link, study today's Chumash.